very much delighted to be joined today by Professor David Hill. You are a pioneer in this field of nature finance and biodiversity markets, and you've been the founding chairman of the Environment Bank, which we might come back to and talk about. And that was established in 2007, which is also around the time when you started introducing the Biodiversity Net Gain, or the BNG, to the UK. And your work has really been instrumental in getting this applied or embedded into national law through the Environment Act in 2021. So I think that's something we'll dig a lot deeper into today. Through decades of work in ecology, policy, and business, you have consistently argued that nature must be made economically visible, and that we need to value nature capital as an essential part of our economies, not as an externality. And I would also like to very much recommend David's excellent podcast, which carries the fantastic name, How to Avoid Moving to Mars. And I've enjoyed it tremendously. And I think it's a really nice title with a little sort of challenge towards Elon Musk. So let's try to save our world rather than reallocating somewhere else. And I think if you want to start somewhere, I think the episode with David Gray, the famous musician, and how he actually, through a Christmas gift, came to sort of be very much involved in paying for nature restoration is a really nice way to start. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and inviting really, really interesting people to that podcast.
Thank you, Victor. Yeah.
So today we'll try to explore that vision, and we are going to do that over a course of an hour. The first roughly 35 to 40 minutes, David and I will be talking, and then we'll invite the audience to give questions. So if you want, please write questions in the chat, and I'll try to moderate them as good as I can, and we'll try to address as many as we can during the talk. But if there are questions remaining, maybe we can ask you, David, to answer them in the aftermath as well.
Sure, indeed.
So if that's okay, then I'll start with a very simple question. So David, you have said, I think in many cases, that one of the biggest challenges is that nature is still seen only for its inherent value rather than the economic value. And why is this such a fundamental problem? And why is it, according to you, critical that we actually make nature economically visible?
Well, thank you, and really great to be here with you all. Really delighted. You've obviously got a heck of a lot of people signed up for this. This is fabulous. So hopefully I won't let you down. I'll try and do my best to answer your points, and these are fantastic points that you've put together. Well, I don't know that much about the Swedish nature conservation scene. I do know quite a lot about the UK nature conservation scene, and we have hundreds and hundreds of nature conservation bodies, all doing very, very similar things. And I've chaired, or I'm chair of some of them still. And it makes life probably quite difficult in a strange way, because when we try and talk to politicians about the nature crisis from an economic perspective, in terms of our dependency of our economies on biodiversity, and the fact that we've seen a 60+% decline in that biodiversity, certainly in the UK, and this is replicated across most of Western Europe and is even worse in parts of South America and other places, of course. When we try and do that, the MPs, our members of parliament, believe that biodiversity and nature is being looked after by these non-governmental organisations, so it's all fine. And so what are we moaning about? And so it makes our life really hard. And to get biodiversity really understood as a fundamental basis for economic, from the economic perspective. And so it's a really difficult one to solve, because all of those NGOs are pretty much into building their own small empires, whatever they may be. But it is a frustration, and I do see that endless meetings around biodiversity strategies. I mean, we have over the last, I'll finish this in a minute, but we have over the last 10 or 20 years had at least 9 spatially literate strategies that have come out from NGOs and government working together in a very lovey-dovey type of arrangement. And absolutely nothing has happened. And we've seen, in my view, I mean, people will disagree, but in my view, very little has happened. And if we ran our economy as we do run biodiversity conservation, we would have been bankrupt as a business many years ago. So that is one of the problems. And the reason why we've got to make it economically visible is not everybody really understands and really goes and likes nature. I mean, I'm passionate about it, as I'm sure all of you are. And I like to be in it and photograph it and in the wild. That's my life, really. But of course, that could be probably quite a specialist avenue, really. Most people don't. A lot of people don't. Although when you do interview people, they generally do like nature. So if you actually make it such that we understand the impacts on our economics, on our economy, should I say, then it's much more likely, I think, to generate resonance with those who set the policies. And certainly when we talk about economic growth, and that's all we're talking about in this country at the moment, which is horrendous in my view, we have to focus on the economic value of nature. Making nature economically visible, I think, is what we've done at the moment. We are starting to see that, but it hasn't come through enough yet.
Very nice. And I think if we expand upon that a little bit, well, I think most of us have at some point come across the World Economic Forum statement that 50% of the global GDP is directly dependent on nature, and the rest, of course, is also indirectly dependent on nature. So in that sense, I mean, and in your work, what types of estimates have you come across when it comes to sort of trying to price ecosystem services and the value of nature into our GDP measures?
Yes, it's a good point. I mean, if you go back to 2008, we had, and it's very interesting that in the sphere in which we work, people tend to forget. Within 5 years, people have forgotten what happened 5 years ago. And in 2008, there was a chap called Pavan Sukhdev, who was a tremendous advocate for the value for valuing nature. And we had something called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, or TEEB work, that basically was the first to start to put economic valuations on nature. And that was an eye-opener, really, for most people. I don't think the NGOs really understood the importance of that for a long while. But then only a few years ago, we had something called the Dasgupta Review, which was by Partha Dasgupta, University of Cambridge economics expert. And he basically did all the same things and came up with the same sorts of figures. But we've been doing this for the last nearly 20 years. And so I think that if you look at that World Economic Forum and others that have come along, the PricewaterhouseCoopers or the PwC work as well, and it's telling you that you have a business risk of potentially 55%. That is pretty serious, and yet we've actually zero valued nature. And so if you're a shareholder or an investor and you're putting money into something that potentially has a 50% risk of going south, you really need to know about it. And that's been a game changer. So I think that within that, we've then looked at how much money do we need to actually turn the corner on biodiversity and shift the dial. And the most recent work that I could quote is from we have this Green Finance Institute, that was partially funded by government. And they came up with the figures, I think, are around 4.6 to 9.7 billion pounds a year in the UK would be needed until 2030 to really make a difference. And then when you look at what the NGOs and government spend, it's less than $1 billion. So we really have got you cannot do nature restoration without private sector. And I think that's that would be my main takeaway on that. And that's where I've sort of tried to look at how do you get that scaled and how do you actually get people to start to buy into it.
Very nice. And I think that that really sort of touches upon what we sometimes refer to as the nature funding gap.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
Again, I think those estimates that you give there, they resonate very well with, there are some recent reports from McKinsey and from Bloomberg and so on, and the global sort of nature finance gaps is roughly estimated to be around somewhere between 250 to 700 billion.
Yeah.
And of course, that in one way could look tremendously large, but at the same time, it's not that large if you put it into context, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's fascinating because I could come on to this. But when I started looking at habitat bank costs and how much it costs for developers to do biodiversity net gain, if they do it all off site, it's about 0.6% of gross development value. So bizarrely, if you look at the $700 billion finance gap that we need to restore ecosystem function on which that 55% of global GDP relies, a GDP of, I think, what it would be $105 trillion globally. Funnily enough, 700 divided by 105 is about 0.6%. So it's really strange that, it's a throwaway figure, that, and there's probably not a great deal of science behind it, but it says that, and just as you've said, Victor, 0.6% is insignificant. It's the amount of money you'd lose down the side of the sofa if you're all sitting on the sofa and losing money out your pocket. 0.6% is nothing. And can we therefore not afford 0.6% to underpin an asset class that contributes 50% to our global GDP? It just doesn't make sense. And we'll come on. I discovered some fairly interesting statistics around the value of the US ecological restoration market, which means that we really can we cannot afford not to invest in natural capital and nature.
Very nice. And I guess that brings us directly to the sort of the concept of biodiversity net gain and how you actually try to find institutional mechanisms to create a market surrounding channeling additional private funding towards nature. So perhaps you could just start by, for those not very familiar with the biodiversity net gain, say a few words about how does it work in practice and how did you bring it from a concept to legislation in the UK?
Well, the story starts around 2006, 2007, as you mentioned. I'd been working with the development sector for many years and realized that all the mitigation schemes I was designing to compensate or mitigate for the impacts of those developments on biodiversity were just failing. They were a complete waste of time. So I'd spent 15 years plus really wasting my time doing those. And so I decided there must be a better way. So I looked at what they were doing in the States in terms of biodiversity offsetting and brought the whole idea, to the UK and said, how could we get this to work? And it took a huge amount of lobbying effort. I mean, I'd spoken to around 15 ministers of state and 5 secretaries of state who operate the departments that are responsible for construction and all of those sorts of things, and agriculture. And it was a constant problem with turnover of ministers. We go through ministers here like nothing else. It's extraordinary. The turnover is mental. And even more recently, you don't know who's in post from one week to the next at the moment. So that was a big problem. But what I basically managed to really get people on board, so that originally the Labour Party, which is our politically left party, were really 2 people there were very interested. They then lost the election. Then the Conservative Party came in. The Conservative Party are much more aligned. They understand land, they understand agriculture, they understand the environmental protection requirements. So that even though they're on the right, they were much more and are much more aligned to what we were trying to do, because I wanted to try and see this as a market. So you'd get a system where developers didn't need to worry about all this stuff that they were trying to fudge on the development side. They would basically work out how to actually compensate by buying into other people bringing forward land for nature conservation. And that's how it started. And we set up pilot projects in 2011, I think it was. The government then set up something called the Ecosystem Markets Task Force, and got me to be a member of that. And the first recommendation of that report to government was to make biodiversity offsetting, as we still called it then, a mandatory requirement of planning. And we hit all sorts of barriers. So the development industry saying, well, it would be a burden, it would make us uncompetitive, we couldn't afford to do it, and so it was dodged for many years, and made voluntary. And we did voluntary pilots, which failed. And the reason they failed was because they were voluntary. The developers didn't have to do them. And so I said, the only way you'll get this to work is if you mandate it into law. So we carried on. And by 2019, the Chancellor of Exchequer announced that it was going to be mandated into law in the Queen's speech. 2 years later, it was mandated into law. And then I talked to the Secretary of State then, who said, well, we need a 2-year implementation period for the developers and for the local planning authorities to get used to it. And of course, I said, well, they just do it in 3 to 6 months, because they won't do anything until the final 3 months. Bizarrely, why don't you get that? And that's exactly what happened. They didn't. And so we didn't need an implementation, but it was implemented, came in February 24. And I then needed to I'd only had 4 or 5 staff then, and we were running it on fumes. I was putting money into it myself. And then we managed to get an institutional investor that said, this is a great idea, we will back it. And we ended up raising around 240 million to put into habitat banks, which was and I since have exited that. I've kept some of my shares, but I've exited that for them to do the sort of the processy stuff now of just creating habitat banks and selling to the market. So sorry, long-winded answer, but hopefully that captures a few of the key points, I think.
No, it's not a long-winded answer. I think it's an excellent, very brief story on a very long process. And I can imagine this
took a long time.
Yes, and I can imagine there was frustrations along the road, so to say.
Yeah.
But
sorry, you asked me about how BNG works. Just very quickly. So what we did was to say not that they would just mitigate or compensate for the exact impact, but they would go beyond that, so that they'd have a minimum of 10% uplift on the biodiversity. So a metric was created that we helped create, that measures. It's based on area, distinctiveness, area of habitat affected, distinctiveness of that area and its condition. And then there are various multipliers in there for spatial risk and distinctiveness uplift. If you've got a population of birds that are particularly key, then you can increase the distinctiveness, and you come up with a value, a metric score, and that then has to be interpreted in terms of the actual area of the development, so that a developer might come up with an impact on 100 biodiversity units. They therefore need to do the development, they have to find 110 units. One of the big flaws was that the policy made a preference for that, for as much of it as possible to be retained within the site boundary, so on-site BNG, which fails because you cannot constrain biodiversity within these development sites, so that was a bit of a problem, because it meant that the market for BNG is not anything like as big as it could be if it were all delivered off-site in big scale programs and big scale restoration sites. So the developer works with the planning authority, comes up with a biodiversity game plan, shows the planning authority what they're going to do, and then they get a planning permission on the basis that they will deliver that under something called a Section 106 agreement, which is a legal binding agreement. Problem being that the planning authorities have no means to enforce. So that's why the on-site BNG is pretty much a failure in my view. And we've written a report to demonstrate why it doesn't work. And it also costs a lot more money. So although the developers like on-site because they can lose it within the boundary of the development site, within 3 or 4 years, when the developers left the site, that BNG is usually lost or downgraded or converted into amenity grassland, because that's what residents in housing schemes want. And most of the sales for BNG units are through commercial development. So, warehousing, commercial distribution centres, logistics and infrastructure, where they don't have the capacity to do something within the boundary of the development site. They're then much more likely to go and just seek to buy BNG units from farmers, landowners and brokers of that. So that's roughly in a nutshell how it works. And I think, I can quote, in July this year, the Environment Bank had inquiries for about £45 million worth of BNG units just in 1 month alone. So not all of those are going to convert, obviously, but even if 10% converts, you can see how the market is starting to grow. And there are now, probably over 100 suppliers of BNG units across the country, all having speculated and put money into creating sites on the ground in anticipation of this increase in demand from development. So at the moment, there are two things we've got to do. One is to remove the policy for a preference for on-site, and the second is to get better enforcement and a level playing field anyway between on-site and off-site, so that it's easier. But just to give you a very quickly finished point on the cost, if you actually factor in the cost of the development land that the developer has paid, and the fact that where they put the BNG, they can't build houses, for example, if it's a residential development, then one BNG unit costs around £896,000 sterling. If they were to buy that off-site, it's around 27,000. And you'd think that the developers would leap at that, but actually they don't, because they think that they can control what they do and they can control costs. And anyway, they'll put it in a place that isn't actually material to the development or whatever it might be. But there's a lot of fudging going on. And if we had a better policy of just getting BNG off-site into these big scale habitat banks, then that would be an easier way of doing it.
But should I then interpret that as if you haven't really seen, despite all of this that is happening, you haven't really seen the sort of demand for these offsite BNGs picking up yet? Or
it's picking up now, but it hasn't. And I think that what's happened is that the planning cycle, I don't know if it's similar in Sweden, but the planning cycle here does take quite a long time. And so it's often as an afterthought that they've said, right, we've got to do our BNG. Well, we can actually modify the master plan of the development to enable us to use that little strip of land for BNG. And there's a huge consultancy industry has increased to actually do that for the developer. But for most small developments, they are finding it incredibly difficult to put on site because they don't have the capacity. But if you've got a housing scheme of 1,000 houses, you could lose a couple of hectares for where your BNG is. But that's not necessarily means that it will be of any use for biodiversity. So the timescales from actually designing a development scheme through to getting it through to planning permission and then implementing it can be 3 to 5 years. So, but we are seeing now a pickup in off-site requirement because it's just a lot simpler, and it means that the developer can discharge their liability for that mitigation or compensation work to a third party that is professionally more able to do it. So it is ticking up, but we knew it would take quite a while.
I think this is absolutely fascinating, and I think there is ample opportunity to dig much deeper into the sort of nitty-gritties of these BNGs, and perhaps you could sort of share some of your recommended material with Marianne, and she could spread that through that mechanism.
Yeah.
But I think if we sort of look at the Environment Bank and the model that you guys have built, I mean, how do you connect that to the ecological outcomes and the financial returns here? So looking at your model, what is the connections?
Yes, and it's a great point. I mean, I suppose the key to it was that I couldn't have afforded to do it myself because we needed a. I think so far Environment Bank's probably invested at least 100 million of that fund into a leasehold agreement with landowners and farmers in a way that distributes these habitat banks, which are anything from 20 hectares, which is actually, in my view, too small, through to 100 hectares plus, when it then starts to get really exciting and interesting. One of the reasons for the scale is that the landowner farmer, it takes quite a while to persuade them to set aside that sort of land for 30 years. I mean, they're quite used to doing 10-year contractual arrangements, but for 30 years is a long time. And so the Environment Bank model was that we got institutional investors to support the creation of habitat banks up front, which means that they will pay all the legal costs. They have a legal contracts with the landowner farmer. They put forward all the capital costs of creating, whether it's a woodland, a wood meadow, species-rich grassland, wetland, or woodland scrub mosaic, which is actually generates the greatest yield in BNG units per hectare. That costs money to put that on the ground, and the landowner farmer won't have that themselves necessarily. So that's where the Environment Bank Fund comes in, funds for that, and then does a guarantee of funding the habitat management that's required to maintain the condition and build the distinctiveness of that habitat from pretty boring, intensively managed agricultural land. And they then guarantee that for a 30-year period with break clauses, because and there's all sorts of monitoring and reporting costs that are put forward. So effectively, it ought to be a pretty bomb-proof system that the planning authorities can rely on. And although whilst Environment Bank was the first to start this, now we've got a lot of players in the market, and there's a lot of differentiation in quality. So some don't have any upfront investment, and they'll just say, when you buy my credits, they're cheaper than Environment Banks, but we will use that money to create the first areas, and then they build it in sequence, in phases. Anyway, we can come on to that later in the Foundation for Nature's work, but that's how it worked. But it did need a very significant upfront investment to enable that to happen.
Very nice. And where from where did you extract that investment? Because again, coming back to the sort of topic of today, how do we actually pay for this, and who is going to do it?
Yes, and I got courted, I suppose, by 2 or 3 individuals. One was a developer that could see the value in it, but the key to it was we needed an institutional investor. In this case, they're called Gresham House, and they effectively hold pension fund money from people like local authorities or even our own government's Environment Agency. They've invested directly into Environment Bank, so Gresham House were really the institutional investor that had brought in sustainability funding from pension funds, and largely pension funds, and then put it into Environment Bank with the generating and needing to generate significant returns. And so the idea is that it would be generating probably somewhere between 10 and 18% a year, which is very high. But it's private equity, so some things fail and some things succeed. And because it was as soon as the BNG policy became mandated into law, that gave the confidence, I think, to the institutional investor to come in and back it, and that's what happened. And as I say, I've now sort of stepped out to enable them to get on with building that, and hopefully it will mature and continue to grow. And we've now, I think, Environment Bank's now got over 100 staff, so it's gone from 4 to 100 in about 2 years, which is crackers, really.
Wow. And I mean, do you know if Environment Bank have started paying some dividends back to the investors?
I don't know that, actually, to be honest. I think they do it. I think they do it once that fund matures. So I think they run the thing for 5 years, and then there's a return after that period. So they won't have reached that until about probably 2028 when those funds mature. Because I think what happens is they take funding from pension funds, create a fund, and that then sits there, and then that matures, and that's when the payment returns happen, and then that fund gets closed, and they have to set up another fund, which I think they don't do it. They don't wait until one fund is closed. They set up new funds as they go along, sort of open new funds.
Yeah, so it's a typical private equity type of setup.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's really nice because, I mean, I guess that once you have proven that you will actually pay a return, regardless of whether you reach, a 10 or a 15 or it's 2%, but if it's still a return, then you actually can prove that the model is working and that it pays a return to the investors.
That's exactly right. And of course, now there is more competition in the market, so there are other buyers. And I think the big legacy from BNG will be to engage with the corporate natural capital disclosure market. And I'm pretty sure that will take off in the next 2 or so years. And then, we want to see corporates being able to invest or buy into ecosystem restoration schemes to enable themselves to say that they're nature positive. So, and that's another area. That's the next area of work that I'm sort of engaged with, really.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in just a second here. Yeah. But before that, maybe just sort of in this work, one of the interesting aspects is also, I mean, you need active management of land, and I guess that's the landowner's responsibility to do that in most instances. And to what extent are you starting to see that there are income streams coming back to rural communities through this scheme?
Definitely, so quite immediately with the landowners and farmers that have joined, for example, the Environment Bank schemes, but then there are others. There's organisations such as Nattergal, Oxygen Conservation, who are putting land into these sorts of programmes. I can't speak for them, but I think that certainly immediately the landowner farmer gets the benefit of having his or her land put into these schemes. Now, the bit that is more difficult is to see how you get wider community engagement and benefit. And I think that's going to be quite critical. It's one of the pillars of the Foundation for Nature that we set up to actually say, well, we've got ecological integrity, financial security, good governance. What about community benefit? And that can be from a whole range of things, such as, private access to those new habitat banks as new nature reserves, for example, which is one area, or potentially growing crops adjacent to regenerative agriculture sites that communities can engage with. And certainly in Scotland, and they're not doing BNG yet, but when they do, I think there'll be an even greater emphasis on community engagement and probably communities setting up habitat banks, actually. Rather than individual private landholders and landowners.
Yeah, that's a really interesting model, actually.
Yeah.
It makes me think about the union banking model in the US that actually started. And I think there are a lot of similarities, actually.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. So it's quite an exciting thing to start to see, because if you can engage more people with nature in an economic sense, then they actually understand nature beyond just its inherent value, because it's got, people protect it and look after it if they can see it's got economic returns associated with it.
Very, very nice. And I mean, you mentioned it before that there are some things that you would have liked to see when it comes to the sort of legislative framework here that might have become eroded a little bit throughout the process and so on and so forth. What kind of risks do you see that sort of weak governance structure and policy mechanisms here actually makes this very ambitious attempt and market formation fail?
Really, the biggest threat to it at the moment is government itself now, because we've had a change from a conservative right, more centre right wing to a Labour pretty staunch left wing, and now you'd think that they would be really in favour of nature. And I think, to be really honest, I think a lot of our environmental NGOs were looking forward to having a Labour government that would be potentially more pro-nature. In fact, they are entirely the opposite of that. They've demonstrated a woeful lack of interest in nature and natural capital and wildlife generally. Very much focused on towns and cities and the urban, very, very urban. They are not, we often say not many of these folk have been through a farm gate who are representing us, and they haven't. So unless you've done that, you can't understand what the farmer. And they're also introducing inheritance tax on farms, which will make a major impact on farm ownership in the country and potentially make small farms disappear. But in terms of biodiversity net gain, because it was seen as a conservative mandate, I think personally that they've taken a hit to it, and they've said, well, instead of having BNG, we'll just tax the developer or put a levy on the development through something called environmental delivery plans. Now, those environmental delivery plans, there's no clarity on what they are, what they're constituted of, or what they're comprised of, what's in scope for something that they've set up called a nature restoration fund. The legalities around a nature restoration fund, which is where the money from a levy might go or would go, mean that there's absolutely no ring fencing for nature. So they could collect money and spend it on immigration, housing, dare I say, any of the sort of other industries in the National Health Service. There's no ring fencing for it, and the words that we get from politicians aren't convincing because they don't know. So there's no clarity. So the biggest threat at the moment to BNG, crazily, is government itself, and yet you've got a system where we've got to bridge the nature finance gap. Unless we steal £5 billion a year from the National Health Service, which we're never going to do, we will just continue to see nature erode. That will have long-term impacts on the economy and the economies generally, and also sets us apart from the rest of Europe, because the rest of Europe, with its EU nature restoration law, is really going along in the right direction, and backing private sector finance to support that and make sure it works is the way to do it. The state will not provide, but we have a government at the moment that its thinking is so weak around this that the state cannot provide because we haven't got the money for it. So get engaged with the private sector. So two things from that are the nature restoration fund that they're proposing is a bit of a con in my view. It won't materially come to anything. It's based on writing environmental delivery plans. And when I mentioned at the beginning, we've had 9 such things. We had, over the last number of years, we've had nature improvement areas, integrated biodiversity delivery areas, important biodiversity delivery areas. We've had ecological restoration zones, wetland vision, futurescapes, living landscapes, and 2 or 3 others that I've failed to mention, all spatially literate nature restoration ideas. And the Nature Restoration Fund and Environmental Delivery Plan is yet another one. All of the previous ones failed. They've not had any improvements in biodiversity at all, in my view. So we are in a bit of a difficult position. So we really want to see the Nature Restoration Fund scope reduced down, let BNG and there's something called protected species compliance work that is being delivered by the private sector. Don't turn that into a tax and let government interfere in what is actually a market that's emerging.
Okay, so departing from sort of the government being the greatest risk at the moment, I mean, what do you see from the corporate sector here? I mean, because we have somewhat of a similar situation in Sweden where sort of our current government has toned down the importance of climate and the environment and so on.
Yeah.
And what we have seen quite a bit of is that the corporate sector has stepped up and partially, of course, driven by EU regulations and so on. So what's your view on that? And
so I think that I think that the corporates have got to operate in self-interest, which is about understanding their exposure to risk from biodiversity loss. And irrespective of, you almost want a situation where government has almost no interference or involvement other than a regulatory requirement. And I think that the best thing, the first and most important thing we can do now in the UK is to set like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, make a mandate on corporates to financially report on their impacts on or their dependency on nature and natural capital. All that government needs to do is to set that as a financial reporting mechanism, full stop, so that the corporates have to report this to their shareholders, and that will drive a behaviour change with corporates. Now with chief executives at the moment, we think we're seeing some interest, but it's relatively short-term gain because the CEOs might only be at the companies for 4 to 6 years, so they're looking at what the immediacy is, the short-term view of, can that risk materialize during my tenure? Actually, potentially not massively, but it will be starting to erode profitability, I'm sure. But the shareholders and investors of those corporates are looking at a longer term view. And it looks like now that there's a lot more knowledge and data around this, that those investors and shareholder groups are putting pressure on the executives of the corporates to actually understand their risk and exposure to risk on biodiversity. What they then do with it is, how do we address this? Can we reduce that dependency and compensate for impacts? And if we've still got a residual impact, what do we do? Well, can we therefore invest in ecosystem function creation and building that's being done through the likes of these big scale habitat banks? And that's starting to happen, but it isn't fast enough. But I suspect it will be an exponential curve, so that nobody necessarily wants to be the first mover. But as soon as some start to move, the rest will move, because if they don't, they're going to be left behind, and they may find it actually difficult for themselves to get investment for their own business growth. So that's why I'm pretty optimistic that this new market, which will be, if you look at let's give an example in the UK of 0.6%, that golden nugget of 0.6% applied to economic activity in the UK on a GDP of 2.8 trillion, generates about 15 billion pounds a year that could go into ecosystem restoration, which is 3 times the finance gap that the Green Finance Institute believe in or demonstrated. So that would do the job, and it's 0.6% of gross economic activity, which I think is entirely affordable. However, government would just see it as a 0.6% tax. But they've got to get their head around it, because the alternative is catastrophic.
Yeah. David, I think this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for allowing me to sort of push you a bit on these boundaries. And I think it was a nice sort of optimistic ending towards somewhat sort of conflicted discussion, because this is definitely possible. But if you would, before we let the audience ask their questions, if you would leave them with sort of one key takeaway that you would like them to sort of take away, what would that be?
Well, if I can have 2, I'll give you 2. If you look at what was staggering to me, I have to say, I had no idea about this, but in the United States, the ecological restoration industry is worth $25 billion. The US steel and iron industry is worth only $15 billion. So ecological restoration is nearly twice the value in economic terms, and employs 221,000 people versus 83,000 people in steel. If you apply that to the UK, you'd basically say we've got to make ecological restoration an industry in its own right. It is not a burden for nature. So I think our messaging on impacts is what we've got to look at. It's not strong enough. We're not telling people that actually, if we don't do this, it is going to be pretty horrific. Of course, people don't like to hear bad news, but we've got to. If we don't understand and accept that bad news, we won't do it, and we won't do anything about it. So I think corporate business working with governments have no choice but to find a collective solution, because the challenge, the damage is actually happening now, and that damage is going to increase and really impact on our economies very significantly. Probably far more so than any wars or whatever we might have to foresee in the future. So I would say make ecological restoration an industry in its own right, get behind it. It is massive, it is significant, and it does such good And that would be my message, really.
Thank you so much, David.